So it was just a few days ago, and we did the video on some inclusive event or community policies and related considerations. A few more of those kind of came to mind after making that, and I want to thank those of y'all who contributed in the comments as well. But some specific ones I've found that we basically have applied in our groups, but I just in highlighting some of the major ones missed talking about last time. The one to share here as well are, for one thing, it's actually part of why in GAM Keto Club, and as much as you've seen in my videos and my podcasts, etc., we maintain non-swearing, no cursing. One of the reasons for that is actually an element or an aspect of accessibility, inclusivity. It helps keep environments feeling less hostile. It also helps span sometimes cultural differences in terms of some people come from a more orthodox religious background or a family culture where swearing is regarded as much more severe than in others. And so even though it's not about censorship, it's not about blocking people speaking or thinking, it's just something that helps kind of keep an even-keeled, more professional kind of dialogue. And so it's also, it's something which we have to be kind of extra guarded about, because even among English-speaking cultures, even among different spots in the United States, let alone between the UK and Australia and other places where English is spoken, different words have different levels of gravity given to them, or different levels of casualness. And so finding sort of a common, basically erring in favor of, we're sure these words are mutually accepted in all workplaces, etc., we also find can be kind of a professional assistance anyway, because it helps get people in a practice of they're not going to accidentally express themselves in an email related to a contract gig or freelance opportunity, applying for a job, and they might lose them the opportunity because they aren't aware of that distinction. So it's another thing that, again, non-swearing we find helps keep our communities inclusive across cultural differences, spiritual backgrounds, and so on. Speaking of these different communities and places in different spots, part of why GAM Keto Club is online, that's why when we had the online conferences, Game Dev Biz and Enjoy Game Dev, that we held those events online rather than in person, is that there's necessarily always going to be an enormous barrier for many people to any physical in-person event. Obviously, there's value in those. They're going to keep going on. They'll always go on. They're worth having. They're worth doing. But when you can find a way to add an online component to something, or to execute the same event or the same speakers or something online, one of the things we find, right, is it becomes enormously more accessible to people around the globe who may not have access to the travel, for whom the cost of travel just might be immense. There's also, of course, difficult political challenges, as of the country I live in is kind of crummy for a lot of people to try to get into and even to get out of. And so depending on what you're putting on, what kind of event, what kind of speakers, what kind of community you're building, as weird as it sounds, or maybe as obvious as it seems these days, if you can do it online rather than basing on an in-person physical location, in addition to there's often less overhead for renting a space and so on, it can become much more accessible to people who may not have access to a major city center. This is also why in GAM Keto Club, so many of our members don't necessarily come from the heart of London or New York City or Chicago or Austin or even Los Angeles. So many of our members, because people in those cities have access to local networks, local collaborators, local spaces, baby castles, and Juegos Rancheros, and Glitch City, and so on. But for people who are hours outside of those areas, something like GAM Keto Club becomes a way in which they can find community, enjoy some of the same benefits of community, without necessarily having to physically be located in these places, which also can be really expensive places to live, which again contributes to their inaccessibility to people. When doing things online, by the way, it again maybe sounds kind of obvious, but of course time zones become something you've got to start paying more attention to. This is part of why we hold our meetings basically around lunchtime, Los Angeles time on Sundays. It's a time that we have found generally works reasonably well if it's not too late for our members in Europe. It is a time that works in all time zones in the US, that it's still weekend over in Europe. One downside to this is, I will say, it results in being like Monday morning for people who are in Malaysia and Australia. No matter when you do something, it can be hard for certain time zones. One of our hopes and our intentions as we continue to grow, as we get more people in those parts of the world, is that we'd like to really stagger our meetings into 2 different times to ensure that whether it's because their time zones, it's not the middle of the night for them in East Asia or something, and or also just because there might be people who are based in the United States, even down the street from me, who their particular work schedule requires them to be on the job Sunday midday. So it'd be nice if we can have more options, but of course we're building to that point. So we know that's our goal for accessibility reasons, even though we're not there yet. And this is another thing I want to suggest too, when it comes to any of these kind of policies, and this applies to a lot of things in business, right? It's okay to acknowledge here's what we're moving towards. And just like we talked about in the goal video the other day, here's what we're moving towards. Here's our target. At our current scale, we're not yet there yet. And it helps us identify what are the steps, what are the stages where we can start to move that direction. What do we have to do to check the boxes to be in a position where that begins to make sense for us. And this is a challenge. And I actually want to give a special shout out here to Tiffany Otto, who gave me a lot of the tips I shared in the last video as well. Also shout out to Stephanie Barish of Indicate, and shout out to Caroline Murphy of Boston Fig, and some other people who've helped me learn some of these things. Martin P. But these people helped me learn some of the things I'm sharing today in last video about the inclusivity stuff. One of the challenges in particular that I want to give a shout out to Tiffany for is this thing about threshold problem. And this is a thing which occurs in a lot of different groups that, if we're not careful, only gets harder with time as the group grows. So when it comes to these things about trying to spot, are we to that stage yet to worry about this? This is one where really, if possible, the sooner you can kind of worry about it or have it on your radar, the better. And what the threshold problem refers to is a situation where, so in IGDA, International Game Developers Association, which I help organize for, we have these meetups, right? And these meetups tends to be maybe a dozen people invite some other people who are coworkers, friends, former classmates, whatever, out with them, people who are in their same social circles, and it winds up disproportionately kind of, I want to say, the usual, the largest demographic you see, which again, kind of for better or for worse, people who look like me, which isn't in itself a bad thing. But part of what happens is, when someone who's outside of those demographics, by any metric, by any diversity axis, walks into one of those meetings, walks into one of those groups, which they're open groups. We announce the meetings, people can come, even if they're not even IGDA members, they can come. But if they walk into there and they look around and they see no one who looks like themselves, no one who feels like they have a shared experience with, sometimes what happens is they just turn right around, walk away, and never come back. And this is consistently a problem too, where even in workplaces, part of what will happen is they will have someone they'll have some diversity by some measure. And I heard this was in a group circle at GDC being discussed, where the company was maybe a 10-person company, used to have 1 or 2 women in the group, 1 or 2 people who were non-white in appearance. And there's other kind of metrics that are also relevant, important, inclusive, but these are the first ones people often speak to because they're so much more visible in the groups. And part of it they don't understand, when there's one person who is kind of the exception to the rule in the group, it can add kind of a burden to, well, everyone should be expecting them to have to try to speak to an entire part of the population's perspectives or part of the population's experiences. That's not a fair burden to put on them. And it can result in a difficult situation where it doesn't really elevate to a red flag, an alarm bell's going off, we need to fix the situation, until they're gone. And part of what this results in, again, is this problem of this threshold thing of, I literally have a friend who, woman software engineer in games, who for many years was kind of the female engineer on their team, and recently kind of left from just kind of being tired of being the one that was on their team, which means the next person who does join the team, right, from her background, is going to be having the same experience. And it again goes back to this threshold problem. And I say all this again for kind of 2 reasons. It's not just to acknowledge like, hey, this is part of the challenge, but it's to think concretely about, okay, 2 ways to kind of think about fixing it. And the one that the Women and Non-Binary and SoCal Gaming Group does, they do this thing called raid mode, where they gather together a number of women in games, or women and non-binary people in game communities, game development, esports, and so on. And they'll pick any given event, which in the Los Angeles area, there's always plenty. And they'll say, all right, this month, 15 of us going out to this one, 5 of us going out to this one. And what this helps, right, it helps tip that threshold in an already established group, so that at minimum, they have each other to turn to kind of bounce off and be like, this seemed all right by you. In addition, this also helps other people who, to go back to our earlier example of kind of these meetups, when someone else walks into the group, they suddenly are more likely to see people like themselves, who share their experiences, who understand some of the cultural background, situations, differences that they've been through. And that can help increase the odds that next time, even just randomly, 3 or 4 people might come back. And so these are ways that really can kind of permanently help tip communities back into more diverse, more inclusive makeups of the groups. And the other thing to consider, and again, this is where I say some of these things we can't really worry about until past a certain size, then we can try to fix it. This is one where the sooner you can try to do something about it, the better. And it's precisely because the larger and larger the group gets, it's easier by the sense of, if we can have even 1, 2, 3, 4 people who are different from us by any metric at all, in the group early, when it's 5 people, when it's 10 people, when it's 15 people, then percentage-wise, it's easier to build on that than when you have an army of 100 already piled together, and suddenly, no matter who else is different from whatever the main markup of that group is, the harder it gets to be to crack that threshold to feel like, is this where people like me are welcome? Is this where people like me are understood? Is this where people like me have a voice at the table? And so, just to say again, somewhere really, if you get as much as you can, if you can build it in early, the better. And this is something where it came up where a friend of mine has a company, and he had a problem, a challenge. His team is actually quite diverse, but in ways that don't physically manifest, in ways that you don't tell from seeing photos of people. Like I said, there's many different types of diversity. Their group has meaningful representation of different voices from the community, different background experiences, different cultural understandings, and so on. But so they had this problem of when they would put up team photos on their website, it kind of repelled other people who they wanted to come work with them as well, because it didn't look like it was a group that was diverse. And the suggestion that I had for them is actually the same thing that we had done for my podcast or Gamketo Club's, Gamketo Community's speakers, right? Where early on, before we had enough diversity representation, even in a way that just visually showed. And again, it's important to have all kinds, including non-visual differences. But until we did, we just didn't have photos. We just didn't put up any photos. We kept it as to, here's a list of names, here's people, you can link them up if you care to. But it was only once we crossed the threshold of, okay, now we feel like we can show our team, and to go back to that Natalie Portman kind of quote, right, not feel embarrassed about, like, does everyone look like you? And it's something that it's worth being aware of and sensitive to. And again, I think some of y'all know this, but just to reiterate, it's not ever about finding, making exceptions for people or bending rules for people or only qualifying someone because they look or have a certain background, etc. But what it does mean is it should be putting up your bells to be like, am I putting in the effort to find the qualified people who are outside my usual circles, who are outside my usual network? Because plenty of skilled, talented, capable, smart, well-connected, honest, hardworking, good people, etc. are out there of any background. And so again, these are things why it's important to keep an eye out for. And like I say, being sensitive to if the team is not presenting in a way that you think is accurate or is going to be appropriately bringing in the right kind of folks or helping the right kind of people feel welcome, then that's something to be sensitive to as to, okay, well then we will, that's again these stages where we know that we can see, okay, we're going to have to fix it. We can't quite fix it at the scale yet, but we're going to work our way that direction. Something which has increasingly, and I think has been a positive, been a common thing you see in Twitter bios, including mine, been a common thing when people introduce themselves going around in a discussion at a conference like GDC, but that's basically mentioning your pronouns. So, for example, identify as he and him. These are things which increasingly, it is common and appropriate to hear people specifying not just if they, he, she, or they are either trans or non-binary or genderqueer or otherwise, but basically trying to help normalize that we don't have to expect that someone says those only if it's in some way contrary to what you might assume or guess or otherwise. And as we kind of discussed, like, it's really, you want to do your best to not guess, not assume, and to feel like it's an okay thing to double check with someone before referring to them with pronouns, because that's something which is up to each individual to determine, to decide on what they're comfortable with and how they want to be referred to, just as much as anything else about us. But I think that's all I wanted to add for today. Again, if you go on this for quite a while, a lot of these are not things I can claim to have invented or taken any credit for. I've oftentimes learned from others. I tried to give a quick shout out earlier in this video about some people I've learned these things from, but they're important. They're worth continuing to think about, worth continuing to try to make improvements on. And as with the previous video, I'd be happy to hear about some of your findings, your learnings, your lessons, your observations in the comments as well. And thank you as always for following along, and I'll have another video tomorrow.